Welcome back to KPMG Isle of Man's webinar series. My name is Russell Kelly, Senior Partner here in the Isle of Man. We're now on week 5 of our webinar series and feel that we have covered a lot of ground from cash flow and liquidity, corporate taxes and business support measures, with risk management today and personal tax and financial reporting still to come. So thank you all for taking the time each Wednesday, and I hope you're finding them to be useful sources of information. For those of you who haven't attended one of our webinars before, just a quick reminder that if any time you feel you're losing us connection-wise, you'll see a reconnect button at the top, and that will refresh you back into the webinar live room. If you have any questions, either during or after the webinar, please email them to webinars@kpmg.co.im. With me this morning, I have 3 of our advisory team. I have Elaine McCormack, Senior Manager who leads our regulatory practice, David Watterson, Senior Manager who leads our fraud and forensic practice, and Brian Beasley, who leads our cyber and information protection practice. The focus of today's webinar is on managing risk through a crisis. So we'll be looking at 3 different areas of business risk: regulation, fraud, and cyber, and how they've been impacted for businesses as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've been amazed even on the Isle of Man at the number of reported fraud and cyber attempts since we have gone into lockdown. It is also worth noting that one of the highest areas of our website traffic, both locally and globally, has been those interested in working from home and protecting from cyber attacks and managing their data privacy policy. Just in terms of a general update, we continue to see a move towards easing of restrictions, both locally and globally. And the government released their latest update, which will provide a roadmap for returning to some form of normality, whatever that may look like, soon. This is an insightful document, and we would recommend it for reading. It is available on the government Corona website, but we've also made it available on our COVID support site for ease. There is still a recognition that support is needed, and it is reported that Tynwald will be asked to approve an extension of 3 months to the MIRA and the wage support schemes later this month. Unemployment has risen significantly locally, which is to be expected. Looking further afield to the UK, although the Prime Minister is expecting to make an announcement later this week on easing lockdown and their pathway to kickstart the economy, there have been some details released of what this may look like already. The economic data is still gloomy and volatile. For the first time since lockdown, we saw the FTSE surpass 6,000 last week, although it has dipped below that figure again following various other geopolitical situations. It was also announced on Monday that 6 million people have been furloughed in the UK, which is estimated to be costing the UK government around £30 billion. On that, I will now hand over to Elaine McCormack, who will provide some updates on regulation.
Thanks, Russell. Good morning, everybody. So as Russell says, I'm going to cover off regulatory risks, just thinking about the types of increased risk that your business might be susceptible to at this time. And also just looking at some of the updates and the practical guidance there has been from the regulator and talking a little bit about their expectations as well. And that's how we're going to start this next slide. So obviously the FSA are fully aware that the various licence holders might have experienced operational issues as we've all transitioned from our normal working day to be able to have, in most cases, the majority of staff working from home. And the regulators have actually looked at a regulatory forbearance framework and actually how they might be able to help licence holders, but still making sure there's that sufficient oversight and control within a business. Because actually, don't forget, from their side, the regulators had to adjust to having the majority of their staff working from home as well. So they're all too aware of where the issues are. I think if you take anything away from this slide, the most important piece I would say is just to keep the regulator informed. They're certainly not mind readers. Just be proactive, keep them up to date with any material matters that you think that they should know about. The FSA ordinarily will expect firms to notify them as a matter of course where you're experiencing difficulties in complying with your regulatory requirements. And really, this situation isn't any different. So if you are having any issues, just pick up the phone, drop them an email, just let them know that anything that might cause interruption to the services that you provide to your clients, or actually endanger your ability to provide the services that you do. On their part, the FSA are continuing to reach out to licence holders, some through firm-specific engagement, but they're also conducting some sector overview work. And actually, just as we undertake risk-based approaches for our clients, the FSA have also got a risk-based approach for their licence holders. And so some firms might well receive more regular contact than others, and they might be expected to update the FSA more frequently, but they'll let you know where that is the case. If you haven't seen the latest update, there was an update from the regulator yesterday. What day are we on today? We're on Wednesday, so actually on Monday morning. They're looking to undertake some further work to try and understand the impact of the pandemic on cash flow within businesses, where there isn't already forward-looking information. And some sectors do already provide that forward-looking information, the likes of banking and insurance, but some other sectors don't. So they're looking to find out how businesses are readjusting their business model and their operations. And they're going to start off by looking at a sample of firms within the investment business and the fiduciary sector. So not everybody will be asked to provide that information. We're all aware that there's standard notification requirements right throughout the regulations. Primarily, these are within the rule book, and these should be continued to be met where that's practicable. If there are any delays, then notifications really should be made as soon as possible to that required notification date. And where you have got significant operational issues or you're under significant final strain, in the current circumstances, it's really not appropriate to just wait until that regulatory threshold or the trigger's breached before you make the notification. The regulator is going to be expected to be given a heads up if that is the case. We've recognised that there might be some difficulties in areas such as finalising audits. They have agreed some specific extensions. I'll cover more on that in the next slide, but the regulator won't be treating any delays in respect of audits as breaches in the immediate instance. So just moving on from notifications, it's really important as well that you're able to demonstrate your decision-making processes at this time, because I'm sure we all have different ways of doing things. We might have different processes than we normally would have. Make sure you document them. Make sure you document your reasoning behind them as well, because actually that might well form part of a visit in future, and you might be expected to be able to demonstrate why you've made certain decisions. The directors of a company, for those of you who are directors, obviously you're ultimately responsible for managing your business. And the FSA not only expects the directors to demonstrate why you've made certain decisions, but obviously also to fulfill your ongoing duties, both towards the regulated entity, but also your clients as well. Now, I mentioned about financial strain just above, and obviously it's understandable in these times that there might well be financial strain on licence holders. The FSA has issued a reminder to firms just to make sure you maintain sufficient resources, both capital and liquidity where that's possible, and to act prudently when you're making decisions around things like dividends, but also where license holders are part of a group, and just make sure you exercise prudence when you're upstreaming excess capital and liquidity, or you're taking any other decision that could potentially weaken the Isle of Man entity. I think finally, just in this section, just to reiterate the importance of treating customers fairly, it's a current regulatory rulebook requirement anyway, and it's certainly of no less importance in the current situation we're in. The regulators issued guidance to consumers, particularly really about scams that might be prevalent at this time, but also focusing on the requirement for firms to treat customers fairly. And if anybody's interested, that can be found on their website. You can have a look there. The next information might well be a little bit too late in the day for some people. We've had so much content to try and fit into our webinars. We've been trying to juggle these around for the last few weeks, but I mentioned in the first slide about a regulatory forbearance framework. And lots of you on the call, no doubt, will have 31 December year ends, and therefore ordinarily would have been due to get your regulatory reporting in by the end of last week, by the 30th of April. It was part of the forbearance framework I mentioned on the previous slide The regulator's given an extension to those firms that need it. So if your audited financial statements or your connected auditor confirmations, your management letters, your annual compliance return isn't ready, you can now have up to 6 months to submit it if that 4-month deadline isn't possible. Some of you will no doubt have already been able to comply with the 4-month deadline. I know there was a fair few clients of mine who've already submitted within that 4-month time frame. But if you do need longer, you can take that time, and you didn't need to know the FSA, notify the FSA in advance if you were going to make use of the extended time frame. So it certainly might well be of use for those of you who've got January year ends. The regulator, however, has requested that if you submit any information to them, so your annual regulatory reporting, your financial resources, audited accounts, etc., please send it through in electronic format. Just send it through password protected PDF document and send a separate email with your passwords. Normally, documents that will require a wet signature, the FSA will be accepting scanned copies of PDF, so of the original document. Hard copy should only really be sent through if the authority have specifically requested you send a hard copy through. Some licence holders on the call today will have a normal submission deadline of 6 months after the year end. I'm afraid there's not another 2 months for you guys. If that's the case, there's no changes that apply at this current time. And again, it's really important that if you can't meet that extended deadline, just pick up the phone and let the FSA know. Finally, just on this section, all firms that have to comply with the minimum financial resources requirements, which is going to be all licence holders other than the Class 1 deposit takers and certain Class 8s. If a delay to your audit means you don't have a new annual audited expenditure figure to include within your FRR return, just use the figure from the previous financial year end. And if you find that results you falling below or within the 110% of your minimum regulatory requirement, again, just notify the FSA. So just moving on slightly, the FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, have also issued a brief kind of separate guidance to business. They are due to conduct and actually publish a risk assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on financial crime, both on the Isle of Man and internationally as well. They made an announcement at the beginning of April, I think it was the 2nd of April, that would actually be imminent. But I've not seen anything as yet, and I did check the website this morning just to see if there was anything there as yet. So keep a watching brief on that one. It's a sad fact, unfortunately true at this time, that there is an expected increase in financial crime and money laundering because criminals will do everything they can to take advantage of situations where people are vulnerable, they feel vulnerable. And actually, people and businesses that are in trouble might conduct criminal activity to compensate for financial losses. And I know David's going to touch more on that in his presentation. But I think the clear message coming out from the FIU is really don't drop your guard at this time. I think it goes without saying anyway that the MLRO function is really of critical importance to a business during your normal operations, but it's actually really of increased importance at this time. And the MLROs, for those of you on the call, just make sure you have that higher level of vigilance. Just consider the risks to your business as well. Are there any increased risks that you're facing at the moment? If so, what are your key mitigation strategies? And actually, from an FIU perspective, since we've moved to online themis reporting, SARs are submitted normally online, but again, just like the FSA, just let the FIU know if you're experiencing any delays, anything that's going to prevent the SARs being submitted on a timely basis. Staying with the AML CFT theme, the FSA have also issued some up-to-date, fairly in-depth guidance actually as to how firms can comply with the code. Because obviously it's quite hard while observing social distancing and self-isolation. They have acknowledged that it's a moving feast. The guidance will be added to when it's appropriate. So make sure you have a look out for the guidance on their website. And as always, guidance isn't law, but it is persuasive and it's deemed by following the guidance that you're meeting code requirements. So it really is there to help you. I think the key message from the regulator is it remains vital that you continue to verify the identity of your customers so you can determine that actually they are who they say they are. Just look at the information you've got, the documents you have, consider them on a case-by-case basis, taking into account any risks that's posed by the customer, but also any introducer that might be involved as well. We might well have adopted different processes at present to try and adapt to our current working situation, which is absolutely fine, but just make sure you document the processes you have and the reason for taking the approach you have as well. Now, obviously, meeting customers face-to-face isn't possible at the moment, but virtually meeting them through video conferences is perfectly acceptable. So scanned and photographed or photocopied documents might be used and verified via a video call. Selfies, I think there's a word we never thought we would see in regulatory guidance, but actually the handbooks had selfie verification as being acceptable for identity documents for quite some time. But the regulators also now said to consider using it for address verification, and not quite asking somebody to go outside and run down and take a picture with the street sign at the end of the road, but a clear scanned copy of their address confirmation document should be provided, photograph of the person's face and image being held in the same picture. And actually the handbook also allows statements and bills in e-formats as residential address verification, but it's really important that they should show the person's full address, not just the email address. And actually you can verify those by one of the above methods, whether that be video calls or selfies. If you actually have a look at section 7 of the handbook, it's fairly flexible. Section 7 says that actually in some cases you might be satisfied your customer is who they say they are without having to verify all suggested components of identification, for example, address. And that's acceptable provided it's signed off by a member of senior management. I think I need to caveat that and really say it's important to state that actually that's not an excuse for a shortcut just because you're finding it a bit difficult to do something. So consider each on a case-by-case basis. And actually, if you take the decision to implement the change for a whole class of customers, make sure you document that in your business risk assessment. And once that's documented, you don't need to sign that off on an individual case-by-case basis. Just picking up on some further bits of AML CFT guidance out there, the regulator does expect everybody's favourite annual AML training to carry on and be undertaken, highlight of everybody's year, I'm sure. The authority will take a pragmatic approach and do expect companies to be proactive and take some proactive measures. I know there's some clients on the call today that were due to be on our AML training sessions, which we had to cancel, but we're now looking to deliver these via Teams. So I'll be in touch with those who've already booked on there. And if that's something that you feel you would like to attend, just drop me a line and get in touch. Just moving on to signatures, just consider whether you actually need a wet signature or whether an electronic signature is acceptable at the moment. Obviously, it's going to be very much on a case-by-case basis for all different businesses, depending on what the document is. But the Electronic Transactions Act, there, have a look at that also for some further guidance, because that sets out and says that transactions aren't going to be invalid merely because they take place either wholly or partly by means of electronic communication. So that should provide some comfort there as well. The handbook does allow CDD to be obtained electronically, but the authenticity of the document must be appropriately verified. So if you're moving from wet to electronic signatures, again, make sure you document it in your business risk assessment, your technology risk assessment, where it might apply, just where that's appropriate. And finally, just on this side of the AML, or the guidance from the regulators, not really specifically COVID related, but there is some sector specific guidance that's been issued for both banking and for money lenders. So we've any of those on the call, that might be useful for you guys to go in and have a look at that. There's some various consultations and responses within the insurance sector as well. So just go and have a look at those if you feel that they're going to have an impact on your area and importantly would like to submit a response. So aware that I've covered quite a bit of information over the last few slides, I wanted to try and sum up some practical steps you can take to protect yourselves, but protect your business obviously as well, just including some areas where there haven't been updates from the regulators. I think there's so many I could choose from. We're limited to time on the webinar, so I've stuck to a top 7. And firstly, I know I kind of mentioned this to death throughout the presentation, but just consider regulatory expectations. What should you be letting them know? What do you need to let them know? The second part is thinking about your material outsourcing. Just review your arrangements as part of your business continuity plan. I know part of, pretty much all of us will have enacted some or part of our business continuity plan within the last few weeks. But what alternative arrangements have you got in the event that any outsourced party can't provide the services that they have been? But actually, are you aware of any material changes in their controls as well? And would that have an impact on the way that you're operating? Think about the changes that you've made to your business. Do you need to update that business risk assessment, your technology risk assessment? Think about additional risks and how you're mitigating and controlling these. Have you made any changes to your risk appetite? We talked about accepting scanned copies of documents. And actually, have any changes mean you might need to update your customer risk assessment as well? I touched a bit on business continuity plans, but think about actually what's worked and what hasn't worked and what changes you might need to make to your BCP as well. The original and everybody's favourite C word before coronavirus came into our lives, compliance. We can't escape it, unfortunately. And just be careful that your control and oversight procedures don't slip during our working from home. You still need to make sure that the business is complying not only with your regulatory requirements, your legal obligations, but actually also your internal policies and procedures as well. And I mentioned in the previous slides, make sure you document your decision making, particularly where there's exceptions to your normal business practices, because they may come under scrutiny from the regulator post-pandemic. And finally, from me, just think about data protection issues, particularly where there's been changes in processes. Keeping data protected is still really of primary importance. So think about any issues that staff might have with working from home, data security, and how that might be impacted as well. I think if I could just end my session by urging you to keep an eye on the regulator's website updates. That's the last one was published there on Monday morning, but they are being updated on a frequent basis. If there's anything you're not sure on, if there's anything you think we can help, Russell had mentioned the email address, just drop me a line. And I'm now going to hand over to David. He's going to have a look at fraud risks.
Thanks, Elaine, and good morning, everybody. So far you've heard about the impact of the environment on regulated businesses, and particularly about the expectations of regulators. In this section, I'm going to share with you some thoughts on the implications in terms of fraud risk, and that's whether you're a regulated business or not. So the quote that I'm putting up on the slide at the moment is from a journalist commenting on the response in the United States to a much more limited outbreak of the Ebola virus. But I think the observation here is very apt to the circumstances we find ourselves in today. So no doubt many of you, like me, will have been following the news a little more closely than usual in the last few months. And if so, you'll have undoubtedly seen many examples of selflessness, resilience, and adaptability. But you'll also have seen or heard accounts of behaviours that are either selfish, thoughtless, or downright dangerous. Unfortunately, people's fears and anxieties can drive them to behaviours that may make a difficult situation worse. And it's those same fears and anxieties that can also contribute to an environment where fraud and misconduct risks can be exacerbated. So here are just a few headlines, and they're a small sample of many reports of fraudsters directly seeking to extract cash, whether that's in exchange for PPE, tests, treatments, either that never materialize or that are ineffective, the opportunity to invest in companies that are offering solutions to the pandemic, possibly for charitable purposes that ultimately turn out to be less than charitable. These schemes are directly trying to exploit people's fears and anxieties, and often they're specifically targeting those that are the most vulnerable. And this is nothing new. It's happened for as long as commerce has existed, but COVID-19 just happens to be a particularly good opportunity because it looms so large in the public consciousness. And scams have involved everything up to and including very sophisticated campaigns orchestrated by organized crime gangs. So you might want to consider, in this respect, how to protect your employees and counterparties from these types of scam. It's very common that they'll try and purport to be from a reputable organization such as your own. Consider if there's anything in the way that you're interacting with counterparties at the moment that could be open to exploitation and seek to try and reduce that risk. Now, these same fears and anxieties are also going to be leveraged in attempts to extract information or gain access to computer systems, which are potentially quite a significant external fraud threat to organizations. And again, this is not a new phenomenon, but the circumstances we find ourselves in amplify the risk of people clicking on that suspicious link that's purportedly from their bank, or downloading that malware-laden piece of software that's purportedly going to enable them to share files with a prospective customer. Brian is going to cover that and cybersecurity risks more generally, and how to defend against those risks in the next segment. So I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'm going to move on to something else. What I would like to talk a little bit about in this session is the fraud triangle. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, let me just explain. If you took chemistry at school, or maybe you've completed fire safety training, you may be familiar with the fire triangle, and that sets out 3 things that are needed for a fire to occur: a fuel source, heat, and oxygen. And if you remove any one of those things, the fire will be extinguished. The fraud triangle applies a similar concept to fraud risk management. So whether they're an employee, a contractor, a supplier, a customer, or an unconnected third party, a would-be fraudster needs the motivation to commit the fraud, and in some versions of the triangle, this is also referred to as a pressure, the opportunity to do it, and a rationalization for doing it. So something to help them recalibrate their moral compass to do something that their conscience might otherwise prevent. Now, these elements have arisen prior to the COVID-19 crisis and will continue to arise afterwards. Nevertheless, the current circumstances have created an environment where these elements are more abundant than usual. So we've seen that frauds often arise, or at least are uncovered, during straitened times. The global financial crisis and the dot-com bubble were littered with examples of high-profile fraud and corporate misconduct. But let's now look a little more closely at each of these elements in turn and how they're affected by our current circumstances. So firstly, under motivation, one thing is financial hardship. So sadly, at the moment, despite the best efforts of companies and governments to keep the ship stable, people are experiencing financial hardship in greater numbers than would normally be the case. Even in normal times, experiencing financial difficulties is going to be a common reason for committing fraud. All other factors equal, we might then expect more fraud motivated by financial survival in current circumstances. To achieve results. So, I mean, certainly in more normal times, people may be motivated to massage results to hit bonus targets. Managers' motivations for misrepresenting an entity's financial condition now may be weighted more towards saving the entity and the livelihoods of those that depend on it. So, for example, presenting themselves as meeting criteria for bank or government funding when in fact they don't. It's also worth noting that addictions may arise or be aggravated by the stresses brought on by the uncertain outlook that we face. And those seeking to fund their addictions have also historically turned to fraud to do so. Moving on to rationalization. There is certainly a potential for an attitude of desperate times call for desperate measures. So a fraudster may justify themselves that they are only borrowing and will set things right when circumstances improve. You can also think particularly about situations where there might be financial statement manipulation, that the fraudster may feel that they're not personally taking anything and are only really doing what's needed to help the company survive, which they see as a potentially lesser of two evils. Again, there could be an earnest belief that they will be able to correct things further down the line, but whether that's the case will remain to be seen. Likelihood of detection is an interesting one, and I'll address that more when we get to the point of opportunity, but there's certainly the possibility that a fraudster at the moment will feel that the likelihood of them getting caught is lower than it would usually be. And feelings of injustice or inequality in the fraudster's circumstances compared to others could also increase their rationalization or their ability to rationalize what they're doing. So it could be that they have a belief that others have got off lightly in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on their lives, and that they're simply redressing the balance. So in better times, this would typically manifest as a disgruntled employee getting even where they perceive that they've been, for example, unfairly passed over for a promotion. So let's look at opportunity now. So as Elaine mentioned earlier, business continuity plans are being severely tested in these times. I think few of us would have prepared them envisaging that most of their counterparties would be invoking their BCPs at the same time. So the measures that businesses are having to take to weather the storm themselves, as well as handling the changes that their counterparties are requiring of them, are having wide-ranging impacts. So changes in business processes and working methods, particularly the sudden increase in working from home and possible reductions in available capacity due to illness or furlough, may create significant new opportunities for would-be fraudsters. So in terms of resource constraint, those temporary or either temporary or permanent reductions in headcount or budgetary constraints might have an impact on the control environment. So there may be difficulty in maintaining pre-existing segregation of duties. There may be difficulty in performing certain controls at the same frequency as they were previously. The redirection of management and staff attention away from control activities that would take place during normal times to deal with firefighting activities has the potential to exacerbate the problem and reducing the operational effectiveness of controls, even where they still look good on paper. Now, those firefighting efforts themselves may entail circumvention of control. So, for example, where supply chains been impacted, there's a risk that due to urgency, new suppliers may be onboarded without the usual level of diligence, and that might expose the business to various unanticipated new risks. And in terms of working methods, with many employees and employers adapting to remote ways of working, existing controls may either be more difficult or potentially even impossible to perform to the same quality. So, for example, some organizations will already be well set up to deal with issues such as the verification of documentation electronically. For others, that will be a significant new challenge. The highest risks are going to arise where processes are changed without adequate regard to the risk implications or the consequent control impacts. In some cases, the impacts are going to be obvious, in others, less so. So, for example, in financial services, the sudden change in spending habits, and so transaction patterns for a significant proportion of customers, may wreak havoc on carefully calibrated automated fraud detection systems. And that's going to potentially throw up for them much higher volumes of false positives than usual. And then they've got the challenge of how do they clear those effectively? Now, the examples I've given here are not exhaustive, but they may be more or less relevant to you. Clearly, some businesses will have more challenges than others in adapting to the new normal situation we find ourselves in. Unlike the fire triangle that I mentioned at the top, you may not be able to remove an identified element from the fraud triangle entirely. Rather, your risk management approach should seek to reduce your exposure to that element to an acceptable level. So echoing Elaine's comments in respect of regulated business, to the extent that it's not happened already, all businesses will be well advised to firstly consider the risks that you face and how they have changed in the current environment. As in more normal times, your risk register should be a living document. The fraud triangle can be useful as a prompt to help you think more expansively about potential risks that you face. Secondly, you need to identify where controls have been rendered ineffective or at least less effective, given the changes in business processes and working methods. Be realistic in terms of how controls are working in practice. And finally, where you identify deficiencies, revise or replace those controls. And above all, don't ignore suspicions of fraud, however tempting it might be to turn a blind eye and worry about them later. Addressing the issue head on may enable you to identify ways to improve the robustness of processes, and that's going to continue to have value for you far beyond the crisis. And with that, I'll hand over to Brian to talk a little more about cybersecurity.
David, thank you, and good morning all. As David has gone over some of the areas before, and thank you for that, David. I'm Brian. I lead the cybersecurity, digital and privacy team here at KPMG on the Isle of Man, and I thought today I'd impart some information regarding the challenges COVID has put on businesses, specifically with cybersecurity and those associated areas such as business continuity, disaster recovery, etc. For those people responsible for protecting our organisations from cyber attack, life has become more difficult of late. Whilst we're on lockdown, we've needed to do the opposite as normal to allow us to operate. We've been opening up our systems and finding new ways to work for our people. We have all had to reassess what it means to work remotely whilst reprioritising how we respond to customers. As we collectively consume more news, the BBC and other mainstream media have picked up on the increase in phishing attacks, which you may have already seen and hear every day when you look at the news, resulting in questions from the senior people in our organisations about what our protection and capacity is. KPMG globally, for example, started to invoke its business continuity plans back in January, when the first reported case of infection outside of China came out. But for many of the global employees and here on the island, it really only began when schools were closed and the lockdown began. We'll start with an overview of the current environment that we're all faced with. And it's one thing to understand that the risks have increased, but what does the changing threat look like? Is it only phishing, or is there more to it? I will also delve into other changes we expect you are making and seeing and how they're affecting you. Those of you responsible for managing the increased risk know you now need to work differently. Additionally, I will cover the role of the security function during this crisis for your organisation and what we're seeing. And finally, I'll briefly cover operational resilience, for example, when our suppliers are equally impacted by staff loss and the loss of access to their facilities. But be assured that no organisation has been able to meet the impact of COVID-19 without any hiccups. But we all need to be prepared to learn, adapt, and overcome. What are we seeing in terms of threats? New working patterns, major business changes due to these working patterns, people using unfamiliar IT systems and new applications to the business and to themselves, growing levels of fear and uncertainty and doubt within our staff, within our organizations, within our customer base, and cyber criminals are spotting opportunities. Always remember, cyber criminals are ruthless entrepreneurs trying to make money. There's been a major increase in COVID-19 themed phishing attacks, which is playing on a lot of people's fears, especially in the organization and at an individual level. Since the end of January, we've seen fake websites being built out at accelerated rate from February and onwards. In March, for example, there was an excess of 15,000 new coronavirus and COVID-19 themed sites. Nearly 1,000 sites are known to offer a coronavirus cure. The UK government has tried to stop most of those sites already to date. There are numerous nefarious actors masquerading as World Health Organization and CDC trying to offer advice. Charitable requests for volunteers doing activity has been coming in through Bitcoin and various other areas. There are articles on social media giving miracle cures, which are done in such a way that people are falling for them, and this is causing issues to companies and individuals and their staff. Tax scams, as firms have been looking to leverage government assistance packages. Numerous fake shopping sites offering respirators, hand sanitizers, all of which are collecting payment card details. Collection of Office 365 credentials via COVID-19 themed information sites has been on the rise, and numerous organizations have found their details online and especially in the dark web. Fake Android coronavirus tracking applications with embedded malware have been seen and have been known. And organized crime has literally leached onto COVID-19 as a topic for making fake testing kits and harvesting credit card details. But what can we do to protect ourselves, our staff, our organizations, our customers? Key thing is help your employees stay safe. Raise the awareness of the threat to them. Keep reminding them that there is a threat. Coach them spotting some of the common telltale signs and run through common indicators on emails and external approaches that could be used, such as spelling errors, generic emails, dear colleague, urgency of emails and the requests being made, and the requests for personal details. A lot of these emails may have various embedded parts to them, which could cause your organization some serious problems. Provide them, and this is your staff, with easy access to trusted sources of advice. Support them as they understand the situation and try to keep their fear and keep them calm whilst they're at home. Take sensible steps to improve your email security. Flagging external emails, and this is easy to do by using the report message function within Outlook. Block uncategorized websites unless they are clearly for business needs. protected DNS service such as Quad 9 from Global Cybersecurity Alliance could be used. Take out a Microsoft ATP subscription if you think it'll help, such as SafeLinks. And a good one is use two-factor authentication on your Office 365 accounts. However, it's not always technical measures that need to be done. Simple checks can make a big difference, such as advising your finance staff to have a way of confirming emergency payment requests, a password, an SMS message exchange, anything that is out with the original message stream. Block CEO and business email compromise for fraud. Always make sure you're applying various ways of doing things. As you can see on this current slide, there's been numerous activity which I've mentioned before, such as number 3 there, which is the malicious live Coronis map application, which was feeding on people's desire to understand what was going on with the world. This was a free app that you could download onto your smartphone, onto your computer, which would track it. However, this had significant malware hidden within it, which then got into people's operational and business environments. The key message is there is ruthless exploitation of COVID-19 going on, and there is large-scale phishing happening with creative ranges of scams being undertaken. Maintain your email and web security, and it's more important than ever. But expect large-scale ransomware attacks. If you are especially in the financial services area, they will be trying to deal with it. There are hospitals around the globe, some within the European Union and the EMA, which have been hit, such as in the Czech Republic. But a good thing is that there has been an unprecedented global collaboration between entities such as Microsoft, Amazon, and government bodies such as the NSA in the USA and the NCSC, or the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and GCHQ, working on making sure we are as safe as possible. For us on the Isle of Man, the Office of Cybersecurity and Information Assurance relies heavily on the UK's NCSC for its advice and guidance. In these challenging times, we need to balance strong security with pragmatism. Organizations should focus on 3 key areas: good cyber hygiene, which hopefully we've all been doing in the past, but it's now even more pertinent to do. Embrace new technologies and ways of working wherever necessary to respond to this issue, but do it securely and do it safely. Do your research and just don't roll out new solutions as quickly as possible. And lastly, ensure the critical information in your security functions work adequately in remote working scenarios. You've probably been operating this so far to date, but there is no harm in checking and validating as you go along. Maintaining operations in this state of lockdown requires that our colleagues have remote access to the corporate information systems. This requires adequate capacity of our remote access infrastructure to support the volume of remote working. This translates into adequate network bandwidth and licenses for VPNs, VDIs, and terminal services. It also assumes that our colleagues have laptops or tablets to connect from, but not all organizations provide laptops to their employees. So some will have to relax the bring your own device policy and allow employees to connect using personal devices. However, consideration must be given on how these devices and the information on them will be kept secure. Using a mobile application or device management solutions should be considered in parallel, and disk encryption, disabling local printing, and data leakage prevention tools may need to be considered, if not already in place. There's been a surge and remains one around COVID-19 themed phishing attempts. It is becoming clear that identity is now the new perimeter. Controls like multi-factor authentication, potentially using soft tokens, and stepping up authentication for riskier tasks can help mitigate risk from stolen credentials. But let us not forget, our privileged users and security administrators within our organizations will also be working from home. So ensuring secure and strongly authenticated access to privileged and break glass accounts becomes very important. In the last month or so, organizations and sometimes individual employees have rushed to adopt new online collaboration tools, and we're experiencing a proliferation of shadow IT and the use of unsanctioned IT services. We'll now have to establish visibility and security governance over these services and ensure that their use is in line with the security policies of the organizations. Technical controls like cloud access security brokers can help this. We've all seen the use of Zoom being used by a number of organizations, but Zoom does have its issues, such as having the FBI now investigating it for leak of data and in excess of 1 million people's personal details being found on the dark web. UK government, specifically the UK Ministry of Defence, put Zoom through the cyber range and found that it was full of holes, and it was then banned from use by any UK government department, just so you know. Organisations can turn to the cloud to compute and for its storage capacity. The immediate availability of flexible resource reserves is one of the reasons cloud is so attractive. And we're seeing organisations race to adopt additional cloud services or take on cloud services for the first time. Cloud service providers have a range of robust security controls available to you, but for organisations new in the cloud journey, time pressure is not their ally. Statistics show that most or common cause of security breaches in the cloud is misconfiguration, and the organizations that are new at this will need to balance speedy adoption with steep learning curve of understanding how their traditional security controls map to the cloud environment, what cloud controls they can consume, and which risks might need to be accepted in the short term. A wide range of security controls can be consumed from the cloud to protect remote users and on-premise application and data. Example of these cloud-based controls include secure access service edges, web application firewalls, secure web gateways, and many others. Lastly, let's not forget our security operations. Our security monitoring is a capability that usually lives in the inner sanctum of our infrastructure. Can we maintain its operation with colleagues working remotely? What are the user behavior models we use to identify misuse? Are they still valid given the new access patterns, or do they need adjustments? Adaptations will undoubtedly be required to our incident response playbooks and runbooks to align them with the organization's new ways of working. These are key questions you should be asking of your security teams. In summary of this slide, the key takeaway is really we need to maintain the cyber hygiene. New technologies and ways of working are being thrust upon us, and we're having to embrace them. But we need to track and subsequently manage the additional security debt we are accumulating. And lastly, we need to ensure that our critical information security functions work adequately in this new reality. While we focus on key considerations within security function, there are those which are focused on the extended organization. Firstly, the rapidly expanding digital footprint with low security. How do we quickly rebuild baselines and get back in control? Well, the focus of now for most organizations, including us at KPMG, is to enable the digital workforce quickly and to continue operating. The main question of balancing security controls remains. What is the acceptable minimum set of security controls, and who is going to approve that? The engagement of executives and risk management functions will be key to get the quick approvals of new lower level of security controls where needed, while balancing the mechanisms to come back to comfortable level of security controls over a period of time in the medium term. What we've seen across some organizations is that they do not agree on the alternative processes driven controls, stopping changes to vendor details, etc., and stopping bank account changes for staff. These would be good controls. The second is focusing on the potential of collapse, failure of key niche service suppliers and broader supplier base. In many instances in the past, during normal times, we've seen a collapse of niche technical players bringing various questions around data protection, ability to swiftly remediate additional exposures of left behind equipment, etc. Developing a list of your tier vendors and engaging in discussion with them around the ability to support you early is a key factor to reduce any surprises now, in the near future, and in the long term. Consider the key personnel you require in making any of these decisions, including those within the information security domain and the wider organization. Set up a war room, even if it's a notional war room, but make sure you have those people able to discuss when required. Develop scenarios now based on your new way of working for supplier failures and how to plan with those and deal with them. Link to the operational resilience of the organization. Don't operate in a silo. Make sure your organization can operate interactively. We all know these are unprecedented times, and risk management and resilience are ever more critical, front and center of all decision making. Executive teams should, by now, know or be operating their fundamental recovery strategies. But there are three main points that I think are really worthy of consideration when I look at IT and resilience in this current environment: change management, third-party organizations, and IT operations. On change management, when COVID-19 took full effect, we all moved our workforces to work from home. But because of the social distancing and the lockdown, we have also had to prioritize our services and move all physical operations and trading back online, while still maintaining business as usual operations. This is and will remain a seismic change for the near future, but we have been very successful in the main. I'm sure we've all gone through similar periods of heightened change, and you're probably asking the same questions internally to ensure you're set up for success. What are the most important business services, and prioritizing your change accordingly? Have we, or should we be reviewing our IT governance, risk, and security controls to see how we can simplify approvals and accelerate changes to make us more effective and operational? And above all, asking yourself and challenging yourself, is or are these changes required? Are they essential? The key to success when you have to make so many changes is prioritizing and focusing on what is really important for your business. Third parties. As you look at important business services, you also need to consider the third-party elements. Do you really understand their criticality and their resilience? Do you truly know your full third-party dependencies, their individual status now and for the return in the future? For example, a small outsourced printing firm classed as a low priority with very little monitoring. What are the risks going into administration? Do you know how to source a new supplier, a new vendor, and how quickly can you contract them? In the current climate, there may be an added risk that negotiating new contracts may cost more than double or triple the original contract price. Have you got this considered within your risk management? Therefore, in these uncertain financial times for your important suppliers, check the supplier's current and future financial strength, because historical data such as Dun & Bradstreet is not sufficient. Similarly, consider changes in demand, such as IT service providers. They may have been able to offer you a surge capacity at the onset of the crisis, but can they sustain it and meet your requirements now and as they adapt with your modification to business with time? We are also seeing a focus on concentration risk, with a small handful of suppliers supporting core functions of the industry. For example, the three main cloud providers, you have to ask, if one of them was to fail, who would they be recovering first? The health service, government, other major suppliers and organizations on the island, or yours? Where do you sit in that pecking order? This may be the opportunity and time to start asking your suppliers how they plan to prioritize their customers for the enduring future. Understanding where you sit on that pecking order and consider the implications of where you sit. On the third area, IT operations, they are under extensive pressures at the moment. When all staff had to start working from home, the provisioning of IT assets, remote access, and providing ancillary equipment was becoming very difficult, but we're getting there. And come a Monday morning, can your staff still do your video calls and use the conference call facility? Issues like these have now come to light for many, and organizations' business continuity and disaster recovery plans have been kind of tested or been tested. But we have an opportunity now to learn from the findings and outcomes as we move forward. IT is under undue pressure and new issues are emerging, large and small, and there may be some practical steps that can be taken, such as whether you have effective IT service and systems monitoring to monitor your capacity and the peaks across the end-to-end services, and the ability to identify and review the data to help identify any bottlenecks you're experiencing. Can you extend self-service capabilities to ease the pressure on IT teams? Overall, are you asking yourself, can you implement more agile ways of working to deliver services faster and more efficiently? Prioritize your changes. Focus on your critical third parties and understand their financial and operational resilience. Simplify your IT service delivery and the operating models. At the moment, this is the new normal, and we don't know how long this will be the new normal. It could be for an excessively long haul, or it could just be for a medium-term haul. But we need to figure out, and you need to figure out what your priorities are and how you're going to deal with it. COVID remains a crisis with no clear endpoint at present. It affects every component piece of operations in the business as a whole. Its supply chain, the influence and impact of wider financial and external factors, and critically, people, your staff. From my perspective, I hope you've found the areas covered of interest. There's still lots to do, and it's all going to take a long time to get over this incident. In previous crises, teams have typically only prepared for a 3 to 5 day period, maybe a few weeks. but this crisis is going to be going on for a lot longer. Make sure you have the capacity and the ability for your team to deal with this crisis. Criminals will take advantage. We've seen criminals look for your attention to wander dealing with the crisis, and they're massively ramping up their attacks in excess of 70 times the normal rate. People are vulnerable. People, staff, they try hard to help. They will work longer and longer hours, and their judgment will suffer. People, boards, C-suites become paralyzed because they're so tired that they cannot think straight. They lose focus on what was the priorities, and they start to consider the wider aspects, such as paper and printing and other elements within the organization. People want to be heroes, and no one else can be in charge. There is a danger around the key person dependencies. Make sure you have deputies in place for your organization. Those key people may contract COVID. There may be other elements. They may suffer from burnout and fatigue. People have been known to work 72 hours plus in crises, and this will make them unable to function. Make sure your staff are taking the appropriate downtime and separating themselves from the work environment as and when required. A good practice in the previous and major crises was always send half your staff home as soon as a crisis hits and rotate them through. But we have to apply good practice. Leverage on the past. When did we see something similar to this, and how does it correlate in size and impact? How did we deal with it? When did we last have a major issue? Apply that to the now. What are we seeing now compared to the past? What did we do then, and how can we take forward new lessons from today? What are we doing differently, and has it worked? What have we been distracted by to date, and have they been valid distractions? Do we have our priorities right and aligned accordingly? And always triage everything. Triage what matters. Crisis management hints and tips. Consider how you can stay functioning now. How can you prepare to operate critical services and function sustainably in the long term? But most important, the biggest asset to your organization is your people. Always remember people, people, people. Prepare for the marathon whilst running the sprint is a good phrase to use. Consider reducing the frequency of executive and senior meetings. Lastly, sorry, wrong slide. Lastly, KPMG globally has created a COVID-19 portal of resources available to you to cover multiple of areas. And the UK has been coordinating various things, and there is a lot of things that can help with that. But thank you for listening, and I will hand back to Russell now.
Thank you, Brian. That brings us to the end of this week's webinar. And thank you to my colleagues, Elaine, David, and Brian for their contributions this week. All of our webinars and slides are available to re-watch by going to kpmg.co.im/webinars. And today's webinar will be uploaded later on this afternoon. Also, please don't forget our resource hub, kpmg.co.im/COVID support. And that's constantly being updated with new resources as they become available. And finally, please do reach out to the team if you'd like to discuss any of today's areas, or send us a question at webinars@kpmg.co.im. The future dates for webinars are set out on the following slide. At the moment, it's tax next week, with further webinars subject to be loaded up in the coming few days. So finally, thank you all for attending today, and please do stay safe. Thank you.